It's wonderful to see all of you here tonight. We really appreciate your support of your local independent bookstore, of course, and thank you for joining us. This evening's guest, author Peter Nichols, has written several books, including the internationally best-selling A Voyage for Madmen and A Voyage to the North Star. He is a creative writing teacher and former professional boat captain, during which time he crossed the Atlantic 3 times. Tonight he's going to talk about his latest novel, which is being met with utterly enthusiastic reviews. Titled The Rocks, his book is a mesmerizing and lush tale that is at once a love story and a mystery, and it's set in one of the most beautiful islands you could ever imagine. It has been hailed as the perfect book to read this summer, and you will find that from the very first page you become devoted to the characters, to the place, and to the sweeping story that this gorgeous and compelling novel tells. So please join with me in a warm welcome for Peter Nichols.
You didn't know I wrote books like that.
I didn't, but
I'm going to read a little bit, but I'm going to tell you a couple of stories first. One is about Book Passage. I lived in Corte Madera when I wrote my first book, Sea Change, about my sailing years, because I used to live on a boat, and so that's sort of what I wrote about for a long time. And while I was writing that book, I was very broke. I lived up on Redwood Avenue in a shack beside a swimming pool. And I had dreams of being an author. I've always had dreams of being an author, but I had these dreams, and I'd been in Los Angeles writing screenplays. I don't want to digress, and they weren't made, so I ran away. And I came up here and thought, I'll write this thing that's in my head about the years that I lived on a boat. And so up there by the swimming pool, I did that. And while I was writing, I would come down here to Book Passage, and it became, and I was just talking with Elaine about books and how you love books as objects, and I would walk through the store and I would touch books. I would imagine, someday having a book and my name would be on it and stuff like that. And Book Passage at the time was going through a period of shoplifting. There were a lot of books being stolen, and I was lurking in the there in the book. And Elaine thought that I was a shoplifter because books were going out of the store, and I was in the store a lot. And so she set her people onto me, sort of skulking after me as I walked through the shelves. And anyway, eventually I sort of spoke to her and enthused about it. And then finally I got a book published. And just before my book was published, in the few months leading up to it, I actually worked here in Book Passage as a bookseller to try to see what bookselling, on that side of the desk was like. So that's my Book Passage story. So this is a very special place to me, and I've come back here often with books, and it's a great pleasure to be here. The other is about this book, what it is to me. I spent years living on a boat and being a boat captain, and then my boat actually sank, and I crawled ashore and I started writing. You
I didn't know your boat sank.
Yeah, it sank. Read the book, pal. It's called Sea Change. And I started writing seriously, and so I wrote. And all the years I've been living on a boat, I had no TV, no engine. No, nothing. And so I read a lot. I read. I sort of had a kind of autodidactical education that way, and I absorbed a lot about boats and ships and the whole lore of the sea and everything you can imagine. So I started writing about, when I did write, I wrote about the sea and ships and boats. And when I started to get published, a couple of these have been bestsellers, and they would always appear on the Father's Day table, because they were about harpoons and whaling and death and disaster and madness at sea, and that is presumed to be a male province. And I would say to my agent or my publisher, it's about the writing too, and they're interesting people in this. It's not just sort of male stuff, it should be female as well. But, and then a few years went by and I got written out. I felt I had no more to say about the sea. I'd had enough, and I exhausted my interest, and I wanted to write fiction in the way that I had always wanted to write it without knowing what that was. And I started and stopped a bunch of novels, and eventually I had 6 pages and I wanted to find out, I wanted to continue with that, but I didn't know where to go with it. So, but I did eventually, and I wrote, that became this book. 6 pages turned into a 500-page manuscript, and I wrote this book, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know whether it would sell, but it was, I realized as I was writing it, this is the way I've always wanted to write, and it was completely new. It was about love, it was about men and women, it was about children, and heartbreak and longing and all those things that I have also known in my life. And I took it, when I finished, it was very polished. I sent it to a number of friends. I took it to my longtime agent, and I sent it to him, as you do normally now, as a file on the internet. And there was a long time hearing back from him. And eventually he said, when I did hear back from him, he said, there is so much wrong with this book that I can't begin to tell you how to fix it. And he cut me loose. So I was like a lot of people, a lot of writers in the middle of their career, a manuscript that without representation, and it was a very black, dark time for me. Anyway, long story short, I found another agent. I sent it to a friend in England, and I found an English agent who called me up one day, and he, blow by blow, he itemized everything he loved about the book, which was sort of everything that my other agent didn't get. My other agent now, it's been in the New York Times Book Review and on the Oprah magazine and Time magazine, and not to boast, but my agent has actually, my old agent has actually sort of noticed it, that this, this book that he rejected is doing, has received good advance notice. So he wrote me a nice email saying, I just didn't get it. Anyway, so what I want to read to you now, not to belabor any of this, but is just the first 6 pages that I wrote of this book. And I wrote them years ago. I wrote them, and it seemed to be the end of something. You'll see why. Has anyone read the book? Good. You'll see why it's the end, and I didn't know what to do with it. All right. Excuse me. Just because my nose tends to drip, and I tend to get a dry throat when I read, so these are unfortunate things. You'll just have to suffer through with me. Her guests, can you hear me okay? Her guests had always marveled at how young she looked. Lulu, don't be ridiculous, darling. You can't be 80. In her 9th decade, Lulu Davenport still had the slim, supple body of a much younger woman. Her thick, straight hair, which she still kept long, usually braided or coiled into a loose bun, with fetching whorls escaping at the nape of her neck, had gone completely white in her 30s, and had always seemed part of her abundant natural gifts. Lulu had never been concerned with health or beauty. These were accidents of nature, and one had simply been lucky. She walked everywhere, she gardened, and she ran Villa Los Roques, or the Rocks, as everyone called her little seaside hotel at the eastern end of Majorca, and charmed her guests as she had for 50 years. That had kept her young and vigorous and happy until one December afternoon when she was found sprawled in the Mediterranean sun among her yellow rose bushes by Vicente the handyman. She looked no different after her stroke. She soon recovered her marvelous strength. In almost all respects she appeared unchanged, but with a sudden tiny dam burst of blood, a tumbler had turned in Lulu's brain, and she began to swear. Her new vocabulary was Laurentian: fuck, cunt, shit, piss. She talked of the same things as always, with appropriate logic and context, but with her arresting new expressions filling and punctuating her speech. At first her friends were hugely amused to sit and chat with someone they knew so well, who spoke in a new, rather cinematic language. Yet after a while it was strangely alienating. It was, after all, a neurological disorder. Was this really still Lulu after all? The other change was to her schedule. Its former rigidity eased. Nothing extreme, no getting up in the middle of the night to trim the roses or take a walk, but after her stroke it was erratic. She set off to the market with her straw bag over her shoulder as ever, but at random hours. In this way she encountered her first husband, Gerald Rutledge, one afternoon late in March. They had both remained in the small town of Calamarsopa after their divorce in 1949, yet by evolving antipodal routines, they had managed to avoid each other almost entirely for half a century. Though they were the same age, Gerald had not been as blessed by nature. He'd been a smoker all his life and now had emphysema. He suffered from arthritis for years. His hips needed replacing, but he had a horror of hospitals and had resisted such a dramatic procedure. He walked slowly with a stick. He was stooped, puffing at Ducados, gripping a small 4-pack of yogurt in a tremulous hand when they ran into each other at the local comestibles. His brown legs and arms were wrinkled and emaciated in his baggy khaki shorts and short-sleeved pale blue shirt, cheap polyester garments bought at the Hebersol in Manacor. There were scabs of sun cancer on his scalp, beneath the thin, lank gray hair. "God, Gerald, you look fucking grim," said Lulu. "Why are you here anyway, you cunt?" Gerald's mouth opened to form an answer, but his mind skittered off into confusion. Its tracking mechanism, unsteady these days anyway, was thrown further off balance by the coarseness of Lulu's greeting. His memories of her, almost all of them stemming from the few happy weeks of their marriage almost 60 years before, could not reconcile such stark filth and venom. As his jaw moved trying to form words, his eyes sought and found the small white scar still visible on her chin. Lulu's eye was caught by a heap of splendid blue-black aubergine. She began to move away, and Gerald's hand shot out and grasped her upper arm. She turned to him again. "Piss off, you wretched shit." Lulu pulled her arm free. She walked away toward the aubergine, pleased at the opportunity to cut Gerald and at how decrepit he looked. She'd been mortified by her stroke. It wasn't like her. And while adjusting to the unsettling intimations of mortality, it had occurred to her that Gerald might outlast her. She wanted him to die first, with urgency now. She picked up an aubergine, rubbing her thumb across its firm, squeaky skin. She finished her shopping with brisk efficiency and was soon outside. Gerald stared after her. Some moments later, he became aware of a sensation in his hand. He looked down and saw that he had squeezed the yogurt containers too hard. Creamy curds of frutas del bosque were dripping from his trembling fingers. After a day of cloudbursts, the clouds departed, as if they'd been waiting for an improvement in the weather themselves, moving away eastward across the sea like pink and purple galleons. Lulu walked home along the sandy, unpaved, still puddled road between the white villas and their gardens of fruit trees and bougainvillea and the limestone shore stretching beyond the harbor. The road carried mostly foot traffic and mopeds, a popular out-of-the-way walk in the summer, but deserted the rest of the year. In places, the rough, spongiform beige rocks between the road and the sea offered flat spots near their edges where for years Lulu and the rock's guests who didn't want to walk as far as the beach had spread their towels to lie in the sun, launched themselves into the cool water, and climbed back up again. Lulu walked happily and slowly, enjoying the warmth of the sun. It had been an unusually cool and rainy winter in Majorca. She was comforted by the familiar nubs and contours of the rocks and the gentle sound of the sea that rose and sucked at them. She didn't notice Gerald following her. He was walking at a speed that had become unusually fast for him, though no more than a normal walking pace. His legs weren't working properly. Everything in them was worn, and the regular mechanisms had grown so sloppy that they were threatening to fold the wrong way and collapse. His hips were killing him. Sweat beaded his forehead, his neck, and upper lip. His face had grown pale as the depleted oxygen in his blood chugged toward his heart and lungs, leaving him panting, wheezing heavily. He was dying to stop and light a cigarette, but then he would lose her. He pushed furiously on like a man walking underwater. He caught up with Lulu just outside the rocks. He grabbed her arm again with strength fueled by rage and spun her round. "You'll never," he started, with a smoker's bubbling growl, but his chest was empty of air, heaving spasmodically. Again, Lulu shook off his grip, but she was surprised and immensely pleased to see the effort Gerald had made, how overwrought, breathless, and unwell he was. It occurred to her that with just a nudge he might easily die of a heart attack right in front of her. "You're pathetic, Gerald, an empty hobbling husk of a man." A flame of old anger rose in her. "You're a bolter, a miserable, wretched shit of a fucking... You never developed the film, did you?" The furious strangled words erupted wetly out of Gerald's chest, his body pitching forward. "I lured them away, do you understand? I got them away, His blue and gray glistening face thrust into hers, but he had no more breath. Lulu involuntarily snapped backward from the waist, repelled. But she recovered, or was recovering, as her shoulder bag laden with aubergine, lemons, cheese, and wine, still swinging backward, tugged at her, and she began to lose her balance. Gerald grabbed her arm again, this time his instinct sure to steady her, and Lulu clutched at his shirt, but they both leaned well past recovery and began to fall. As they fell, the sight of Gerald's face so close to hers, spittle gathered in the corners of his thin, rubbery lips, was so repugnant to Lulu that she whipped her head sharply aside with disgust. When they landed, her right temple hit a jagged spur of rock. Gerald's knees smashed into sharp, serrated limestone. He screamed a brief empty wheeze and writhed, pushing his torso, his excruciating hips. They rolled together, not toward one of the flat spots where guests had spread towels. They tumbled off a ledge into the sea. So that's chapter 1. And I wrote that years ago, and that was it. I didn't know who they were, what was going to happen to them, why they were so angry at each other. You know, when you write a novel, you sort of you channel something. I get, you know, it comes from you somewhere, but you know, you channel it. So I wanted to write more. I loved that voice. That was fiction the way I had always wanted to write it. But that was the end. You know, and it's not a short story. It was just that was it. So what to do? So for a while I thought, I tried other things, and then I thought, I really love those two, Gerald and Lulu in Mallorca. And, you know, what happened with that? I didn't know. Had no idea. I just knew they were really pissed off with each other. So eventually I started thinking back into their lives, who they must have been, and then answers came to me. And so I started writing this book, which goes backwards from there. It goes back all the way through 60 years of then their children, and their children are really pissed off with each other. Lulu's son by her second marriage, Gerald's daughter by his second marriage, and these two had gotten together, but are sort of have this Romeo and Juliet estrangement. We don't know why they're failed and angry with each other, what happened with them. They have this deep, dark history. So it goes back. It just went back through time. And as I wrote back, I just sort of discovered it. And it was the most incredible trip. And that's the result. So if that interests you, go get it and read it. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, Betsy.
I haven't read your first books, but they're about the sea. How did you get involved with stories about the sea?
I hated school. Then when I finished school, I hated work. And a friend of mine had a boat and said, let's go sailing. So we went sailing, and I loved it. And my whole life spun off into boats, yachts, sailing boats for about a decade. So I became a boat bum. You know, I just hung around boats, and I did odd jobs on boats. And then I had enough time on boats. I took a U.S. Coast Guard test. I became a licensed captain. I became a delivery captain. I would deliver boats for people across oceans or to charter fleets in the Virgin Islands and the Caribbean. And then I bought my own boat with my first wife, and we lived aboard it. It was a really small, simple boat. It was 27 feet long. It was the size of a very small RV. Had no electricity, no engine. I read by kerosene light. Had no bills. Lived on $100 to $200 a month. Caught fish. Lived like that for 5 or 6 years. And it was great. I wouldn't want to do it now like that, but I sort of miss it in a way, the simplicity of it. But during that time, that's how and then I wanted to write, and my boat sank, and I came ashore, and I started writing, and here I am. Yes.
Why Mallorca?
Why Mallorca? I was brought up in England, and when I was in England, my parents, I'm an American, but my family moved to England when I was 9. And while I was there, my parents bought a house on the Spanish island of Mallorca. It's sort of way out there in the Mediterranean. It's way off the Spanish coast. It's almost as close to the coast of France. It's sort of equidistant between Spain and, say, Corsica, Sardinia. And it's a beautiful, beautiful island. So we went there every summer. That was our summer place. Like some people go to Cape Cod or wherever it is. And every summer I would meet the same people, kids my age, and their families. And when I first went there, I think I was 11. When I was last there as a kid, I was 17. And so I grew up with these people there. Some of them were the local Spaniards, and some of them were the sons and daughters of these French, Belgian, and English, mostly French and Belgian and English families that were there. And so the girls grew up too, and I, it was where I first kissed and groped girls, and I was going to English boarding schools at the time, so I would think all year about Mallorca in the summer. I would get there and I would see girls, and English boarding schools without, all boys, no girls. And so it was a time of incredible discovery. I had my first beer there. I got drunk the first time there. I saw adults misbehaving there in a serious way. I didn't understand it, and so many years later, I've thought about that all my life. It was just sort of very formative time, and so when I wanted to write, so that's sort of why they jumped out from Mallorca, and it was fun for me. I was living in Tucson, Arizona, which I loathe, and it enabled me to go to the Mediterranean every day while I was writing the book. And you were there when I was writing that book when you came.
I was going to ask that, yeah.
Yeah. So that's why it was to get away. I went away to Mallorca, and I sort of found out all these sort of Jungian, threads inside the yes.
Yeah, just wondering, so were you having trouble in school, or you just didn't like the school, or what was going on?
I hated school.
But what about it?
Well, I was in an English boarding school. This was in the 1960s. And this was on the 19th century colonial, British Empire rules the world model. So I was beaten by grown men with bamboo canes. And this was not an admonitory, Nichols, you've been bad. It was grown men who took a great pleasure in it, taking a sort of run across a room and going whack with a bamboo cane on a boy's rear end and drawing blood.
Sure.
And that was thought to be, well, that's what one does, It's sort of, it was good for the boys, and steals them. And my parents, I was telling my mother this years later. I don't know if you want to hear all this, but this is what pops to mind. And she was saying, "Oh, you weren't beaten like that. That didn't happen." I said, "You never told me that. You're making this all up." And I said, "What do you think? I'm going to come home every week and say I was beaten again, bloody this week?" No. So they thought I was getting a good English education. And I don't remember anything about what I learned at school. I do remember a couple of things. I've taught my son's 11, I've taught him how to take 2 forks and a large coin and balance it on the end of a glass. I learned that. I learned a loathing of authority, which then made it difficult for me to get jobs. But some stuff by osmosis came in. I learned a lot of Latin. It helped me speak languages that I speak, and it gave me some, I think, perhaps facility with language later on. Yeah. But I hated it. And so the moment I didn't have to go to school, I didn't. And everything I've learned since. I've written books about, one of the most intensive for research was about the voyage of the Beagle and the relationship between Charles Darwin and the captain of the Beagle. And I had to learn a lot about evolution and the history of science and the collision of science and religion in the 19th century in England and stuff like that. I didn't learn any of that stuff in school. I was enthusiastic. I loved it, so I read about it. And that was also from being on boats, and I was interested in the voyage of the Beagle. So I learned that I could learn about anything, but I never learned anything at school, really, except these things. Yes?
A couple of questions. One is, I really resonated with the description of your book because I'm half British and half Spanish and Moroccan. And I know Mallorca, and
Morocco's in here too. This is for you.
But it's interesting because my memory of the island, which could be shaded, is that in some ways it was fairly stiff. It felt as a child kind of culturally stiff.
Mallorca?
Yes. And I don't know why that would be, but for my question to you is, having that cultural background that's so varied, did that help you in your voyage from nonfiction to fiction?
I don't know the culture or anything helped me in the voyage. No, I'm a dreamer. This was part of one of my problems at school too. And I think I just, I like fiction. I mean, I've read a lot of nonfiction. I've written more nonfiction, but I just wanted to write fiction. And I wanted to write about things like men and women, having fucked up relationships and the things that I have some experience about. And, but the culture of Majorca, so I mean, I don't think so. I think it's just that I wanted to write fiction. I always wanted to, but actually I got to a point in the beginning of my writing career where I wrote a memoir of my time at sea. Then I wrote a novel, which I liked very much, and it did well. It was well reviewed and stuff. And when that novel came out, Publishers Weekly said they wrote a very nice thing about it. They said how I wrote about seafaring and weather, like Hemingway wrote about big game hunting and stuff. So that was great. And my agent then promptly sold a 25-page proposal I had for a nonfiction book. He sold it for a lot of money. And I thought, wow, I can write 25 pages, and it was a six-figure sum. I could write 25 pages and get $100,000 or more, and so I got locked into that for a while, for a number of years. I thought, and they can't, because publishers can quantify nonfiction, or feel they can, in a way that they, there's going to be a market for this subject, or this, and fiction is a wild card. People may like it or not. So I got locked into doing more nonfiction than I wanted to, and I was all the time wanting to write a novel, but I had no confidence, and I couldn't sell it, So I was sort of, dead in the water, pardon the pun, with my writing career when I started writing this. And I think if I hadn't written this, I'd probably be in some highway culvert screaming, and it saved me. But culture in Majorca, I don't think Majorca is a particularly cultured place. It's a sort of touristy dump, really. It's a very physically beautiful island. And when I was there, I went there in the early 60s, so I got to know I got to know it by its rocks and its foliage and its olive groves and its indigenous people and stuff like that. But I think then it became just inundated, as so much of the Mediterranean is, with tourism. And so if you go there now, I don't think I'd like it now. I don't even want to go back, because I want to preserve my memory of what it is. Yes?
What's the timeline from the time you wrote the 6 pages, then you let it sit for how long, and then how long did it take to get into it and then write the novel?
I think I wrote the 6 pages. I remember writing some of them in the Department of Motor Vehicles in Tucson. That must have been in 2008, while I was waiting in this immense line. And in 2008, I started writing those. I was working on these 6 pages, and they just came out just like this. There's almost no change to these, except the thing about Gerald notices a scar on Lily's chin. And then I started writing it for real in 2011. So 3 years, and it was just I didn't know where it was. I just wanted to write in a way that I felt. So 2011, I started writing, and I finished it in 2013, and in 2013, late 2013, it sold to publishers here and in Europe and South Korea. Go figure. And it's just come out. It's a long thing. And this stuff, there was a gestation of this. I've been thinking about writing some of these characters and some stuff about Majorca, little stories and anecdotes, all my life.
And did Gerald and Lulu exist at all before they hit the page?
No. I think I'm Gerald in a way. I hope I don't smoke, so I hope I won't get emphysema and look as horrible and something. But and I'm other characters in the book too. I'm Lulu as well. But no, they didn't. But I have emotional issues in my life with an ex-spouse that brings a certain energy to this stuff, and so there was something that they were informed by that in a way, and but once you start on a character like that, then they become really real. I had a very interesting discussion the other day online with some people in England who read the book, and it was through a book group there, and they were all talking about Lulu, and it was amazing to hear what they thought about her and who they thought she was, and it's extraordinary. They sort of, at best, what happens, and what happened heard, and all these characters, they sort of come to life, and you kind of sit back and watch, you film what they do when they come on, and you take down dictation for what they say. It's really like that. And Graham Greene said that at the end of his life, the people he remembered best were the people that he'd invented. The people he remembered best and loved, felt the most for, were the people he'd invented. They came out of his life too, but he remembered. That was this. It becomes a sort of crystallized essence of a character that you don't really. You're sort of figuring out what's up with that person, but when you write about them, you know. Yes.
I have two questions, and they're not at all related.
It's great.
But the first one, were your parents terribly disappointed in you when you were being the boat bum? Or had you sort of presented yourself, I'm a writer and I'm going to write, or, I mean, what was
My
that
father
phase?
always thought that I should, get a proper job. And it's funny because he used to tell me the story, but he was a jazz clarinet player, really, really good. But that wasn't his profession. He was a businessman. And he told me that when, after World War II, he was playing his clarinet in Greenwich Village, and he just wanted to hang out there and play his clarinet. And his father came to him and said, all right, you've been in the war, you're playing the clarinet for a bit, but it's time to get real and go to work. You put that down and, put on a suit and go to work. So when I was sort of screwing around and doing I don't know what, and, playing guitar badly and trying to write and thinking about what I wanted to do, he copped the same bullshit that his father had given him. Hey, it's time for you to get a job, you've got to be responsible, you can't just do all this. So, and then I think, but I didn't. And then I think he was happy to see me he died years ago, long before I ever wrote a book or anything. But I think he was interested to see that but he kind of checked out. He was sort of distant, and he married another woman. My mother was the most wonderfully supportive character. And whatever I did, she just thought it was great. Or wasn't judgmental. If I wanted to do this, she said, oh, try that. And she thought it was great that I was just screwing around on a boat, completely broke for years. She thought, well, fun. I wish I could do that. In fact, she came to visit me and my dead wife on the boat. And she was wonderful. And then when I wrote a book, she thought, oh, how wonderful. Of course it's going to be. So she was great. And so she never really despaired. She always saw it as what I didn't see. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really grow up till I was in my 50s. If then, but she just thought it was very interesting what I was doing. And I feel that way. I've learned that a lot about my own son. I have no prescribed, path that this is a long answer to your question, but
No, I love
I just, I want him to be happy and to find himself. And my mother allowed me to do that and really supported me with all my sort of circuitous kind of random dead ends and stuff like that. So she made me feel confident. Not overly so, and was that the question?
Thank you, yes, I have another one I'll slip in. Okay, the first agent.
Then I'll get to you, Betsy.
Oh, the agent who said no and rejected the book, and then did you change it at all when you then
For him?
found another agent? No,
No.
Agent.
It's you can sell a book like this. I've been fortunate that when this book went out to sale, there were always in every market several people who bid on it.
Mhm.
But there are other people who said, I just don't get it. It doesn't work for me. And I'm always amazed by that. How come they don't like it? But some people don't. Some people don't. So and it was clear to me that in a way I've been very successful, and my former agent didn't get it. I thought, well, after a while I realized I really have done something quite different, because it's completely not his cup of tea.
Mhm.
But it was very much my other agents. And this is what I'm doing now. I'm writing fiction in a very different way. And my other agent loves what I'm doing, and my former agent just doesn't get it. So what's nice about him is, though, he has on his wall in his office, my old agent, he has a letter from someone, an author, saying, Dear Sloane Harris, this is this guy's name, he's a big wheel in ICM in New York, big career agent. Dear Sloane Harris, I wonder if you'd please look at my book such and such. And next to it, there are 3 framed pieces of papers in the office. then there's next to it is Sloan Harris's rejection letter. Dear so-and-so, thanks very much. It's not exactly what I'm looking for right now. Good luck with selling it. The third piece of paper is a copy of the New York Times bestseller list, and that book that Sloan rejected is like a number 3 in the New York Times bestseller list. So that I admire him for that as a testament to his own fallacy, his own fallibility of that people can be wrong. It's a very totally subjective thing. A book isn't right or wrong. It's just that's the way it is, and some people like it or not. It's just like people. Yes, Betsy.
Are you a disciplined writer? Do you sit down every day at your desk and produce something, or do you wait until the spirit moves you? I have a young friend who's writing and asking me these questions about how focused she has to be every morning to go to her desk.
Yeah, I sit down every day, and I spend about 6 or 8 hours
Wow.
sort of writing, but I also get up and go to Trader Joe's and stuff.
They're not always productive days, but you sit there anyhow.
No. But one thing I do, I get up very early every morning and I go for a run or a hike or a bike ride or something, and I don't set out to figure out what I'm writing, but during that hour and a half or so, a lot comes to me. I mean, a lot of the stuff from this book came as I left over certain rocks in the Arizona desert. But then I come back and I, no one's telling me to do anything. I'm not punching a card. But I do sit down and I write all day, basically, and I can't stand it. So I go off somewhere to take my computer somewhere to a bookstore or a Starbucks or something. But I do spend about 8 hours, most of the day, trying to do it. And if I I would maybe write 4 or 5 pages of nonfiction, maybe 1,000 words a day, but nonfiction, if I can get 500 words done, 2 pages a day, I'm very happy. That's about the rate. Yes?
So when you're writing it, did you write from the end?
I wrote it just as it is in the book. I wrote it from the end of the story, which is the beginning, the end of the chronology of the story, which is the beginning. I wrote backward. And I just sort of groped. And E.L. Doctorow has this wonderful thing about, he says, writing fiction is like driving at night or in fog. You can only see as far as the headlights. But if you drive into that area, the next area will be illuminated. So I would write literally grope backward in time, paragraph by paragraph. I threw out chunks too, but it was amazing how I would sort of see somebody and I would see them, in their 60s or 80s, and I would figure what were they doing 20 years ago. And I would go back. The book sort of has sections that go back at approximately decade intervals. So starts in 2005, then goes to 1995, 1983, 1970, 1966, and so on, back to 1948. And it was fascinating to me to go back and see these people, and you knew what had happened to them. But I had to, you can go back to see why, what had happened, but you knew what was going to happen, but you went back to see what had happened and why this had happened, and it conferred a sort of big challenges on me. I would throw people together and have them have a horrible time or do something, and then I'd have to go back and sort of create that problem.
It's more than a flicker flashback.
Yes. So it was a really interesting thing for me to do. It was the most fun I've ever had writing, because it was like unlocking a puzzle the whole time. Anybody else? Yes.
When you were going back in time, were you taking into consideration the time, the 70s, the 60s?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Very much so. I mean, the 60s has a peculiar flavor and texture to it in every way. I was going back and, and I went back to places and times where I had been and that I knew well. So Morocco in the early 70s, 1970, and the 60s in Mallorca, and other places in the 80s, and I took everything that I possibly could into account. Yes.
I've written a nonfiction book which reads like fiction, and one of the editor-publisher's problems is that it has a very dramatic, this could be the end, beginning, and I'm wondering was there a precedent for that in your reading, or that's just how it unfolded for you to start with such a dramatic moment?
I just saw those two people,
Yeah.
and they had,
That's what
they
they
were
did.
pissed off with each other, and then they fell off the rocks, and
Yeah.
so then that stopped me. But your editor, I don't know. I mean, there's a very editors, publishing is a very hidebound industry.
Yes.
They're there to make money, and there are very few editors who will look at something that doesn't resemble something else. If it resembles something else and they understand it and they think, oh, I can see, that did well, so maybe this will do well. But if they get something that's very different, it takes a very, an editor who has a strong faith in their own opinion to go with it. I would say that the writer is right and the editor is wrong, largely.
Yeah, I felt quite disheartened by it and refused to change it, and I'm now just coming back. Do you think an English agent, since that's part of my history too, do you think that UK agents are a little braver, perhaps? Or maybe not? Just your
Not really. I mean, I don't know whether my agent is braver. He just simply got my book.
Yeah.
And but for an agent to get a book, that also means that agent thinks he can sell it. I mean, it's like a publisher can like something, but if they can't sell it, they're not interested. They say, I mean, I have some really good friends who are writers, very, very good writers, who win things like the Faulkner Prize or the Missouri Review or whatever, and can't sell something. And he gets these rejection letters saying, this is one of the best things I've ever read, but we can't sell it. It's just because publishers are, and large publishers, commercial publishers, they're like movie studios. They're all owned by conglomerates, and what drives them and keeps, and the way people keep their jobs is to keep making money for the shareholders. And the other end of that are the small presses. And those are people who can, with 2 or 3 people can get together and start a publishing house and publish, with online publishing and turn out something that is a good book or an e-book or whatever. But if it doesn't sell, then they're out of business too.
Right.
So the model is to make money. And some people will say, I can make this at a certain level, not pay that writer so much, but as an advance or no advance. But I think, they can have faith and try it. And you have to find someone like that. But, I've heard a lot of crap from publishers and some of my friends about, what's wrong or why it's not working. And you just have to, there's no right or wrong. You just have to do what you believe in strongly. And when you hear something, when it comes in, you hear something, if it makes sense, you think, I've heard a lot of that in writing, in workshops and stuff. Oh, they're so right. I'm so stupid not to have seen that. Why didn't I see that? And it's useful. And then I hear other stuff and I just go, boop, they just don't get it. That's just completely inapplicable to what I'm doing. And that's it. Just keep plugging. One of my favorite stories about publishers not getting it is the story of John Kennedy Toole, who wrote A Confederacy of Dunces. You know that book?
Yeah.
You know that story?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't, he wrote this book, A Confederacy of Dunces, and it's the title comes from the epigraph that he took from Jonathan Swift. When a genius comes into the world, you will know him by this sign that all the dunces are arrayed in a confederacy against him. So people don't recognize, So he wrote this book, A Confederacy of Dunces, and he sent it to every publisher in America, every single one that he could find. They all rejected it, and he committed suicide. And his mother went around with his manuscript for years. My boy wrote this, can you have a look at it? And people go, it's so how tedious is that? And eventually it fell on the desk of Walker Percy, a novelist who was running the University of Louisiana Press. And he wrote something about this book. He said it's easy to take a book like that when it comes in because you'll know from page 1 whether you want to see page 2. I mean, you just, it'll engage you or it won't. And so within 2 or 3 pages, you're going to know whether you can, you'll just say, thank you very much. It's just not what we're looking for at this time. And he said he read the first page and he read the second and then he couldn't stop. So he said, we're going to publish this. So he did. He published A Confederacy of Dunces. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's never been out of print. So that's just another wonderful story about the fallibility of and the subjectivity of writing books.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you all for coming.
Thank
you.
you.